On a day when the Supreme Court of the United States has unthinkably decided to end the nation's constitutional protections for abortion, in place for nearly 50 years, I'm putting out this timely conversation with three people: Chanelle Gallant, Elene Lam, and Shiri Pasternak. People that can help those on the left make sense of why this infuriating convergence of events and other oppressive forces is happening. This story is not just about the hyper-conservative right side of the court, fortified, as the Associated Press put it, by three appointees from former President Donald Trump. It's not just about those specific individuals. It's about how the decision reflects an unaccountable organization of power, an undemocratic capacity to control people's bodies on the basis of, quote, the nation's history and tradition. This is a moment where a deadly slide into zealous biopolitical overdetermination is likely to lead to, as Justice Clarence Thomas said in the ruling, the overturning of protections for same-sex marriage, gay sex, the use of contraceptives. Striking down Roe v. Wade is part of a broader attack by conservatives on racialized and marginalized people as well. It is happening within a legal system that is not so unlike Canada's either. Let's not get it twisted. As Chanelle, Elene, and Shiri explain here, the legal system and the instruments of policing that enforce it historically support injustice. And more insidiously, the language of the law is in many cases strategically designed to make injustice and the continuation of state oppression appear more appealing to a mainstream public that is conditioned to disregard the margins and ignore the violence of the state. In Shiri's words, this is not an anomaly or a question of illegal practices. This is the blueprint of our country. Chanelle Gallant has participated in grassroots movements for sex workers' rights and racial justice for 20 years as an organizer, writer, strategist, fundraiser, and speaker. She's on the leadership team for Showing Up for Racial Justice in the US. She co-founded the Migrant Sex Workers Project and has worked with sex work organizations locally and nationally, including Butterfly, Maggie's, Desiree Alliance, and Red Canary Song. Her writing about sexuality, social justice, and sex work has appeared in dozens of publications. Elene Lam is the founder and executive director of Butterfly, Asian and Migrant Sex Workers Support Network, and the Migrant Sex Workers Project. She's been involved in the sex work movement and migrant and labor activism for almost 20 years. She's also conducted training for community members, service providers, and policymakers on sex work, migration, anti-oppressive practice, and human rights in more than 20 countries. Shiri Pasternak is a researcher, writer, and organizer, and a professor of criminology at Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto. She's the author of the award-winning book Grounded Authority, The Algonquins of Barriere Lake Against the State, and the co-founder and former research director at Yellowhead Institute. Shiri notes that the book that she and two of her collaborators spoke with me about, Disarm, Defund, Dismantle, on Police Abolition in Canada, was in part the outcome of a gathering called the Abolition Convergence that was set to take place in Toronto in May 2020, but had to be cancelled due to COVID. They had planned, she says, to use the event to, quote, build trust and solidarity and understanding across movements. But rather than accept the cancellation of the event as an ending, the organizers and contributors decided to reformulate the project and reroute their energies into creating the book. This is reflective of a spirit of relentlessness that characterizes the movement for police abolition here in Canada. While Pasternak suggests that abolition in Canada is regularly thought of as a copycat movement that follows and reacts to political trends in the US, it's important to see the ways in which their local focus grows out of a commitment to communities and peoples who are directly impacted here by the violence of the settler colonial state. So for people looking for direction and a means of mobilizing, Disarm, Defund, Dismantle is a book that, as Elene Lam explains, is important as a tool for organizing and not just as a source of academic analysis. In Chanelle's words, the book highlights, quote, frontline community defense against policing and the theoretical political knowledge that comes from that work. We talk about the manipulative way that the figure of the, quote, average Canadian is invoked, and how it's usually used to reinforce exclusion. Those seen as outsiders are more easily ousted, criminalized, punished, Lam explains, because they're seen as harming the community of average Canadians. She argues that in this context, the anti-trafficking movement, the anti-sex work movement, benefits everyone except sex workers. So police, law enforcement, politicians, she says, become the heroes, and power flows to the police as a result. There's a lot here too that is specifically focused on the conditions for transformation. Chanelle makes it clear that, quote, it depends on your point of view whether you consider abolition pragmatic or not. While she, as she puts it, can't think of anything more practical than creating institutions that affirm life, those who benefit from the status quo will continue to be, in Shiri's words, deputized to enforce white supremacy in this country. What will it take to break the identification of working class people in Canada with white-owning classes? What will it take to dismantle the basic logic of property rights, by which so much containment, enclosure, and capture continues? How do we grasp at the roots of oppression here in Canada and elsewhere? Obviously, I want to say welcome and thank you for putting together this incredible anthology, Disarm, Defund, Dismantle Police Abolition in Canada, from Between the Lines. It's a book that I guess I wanted to start by addressing in terms of its own impetus. You talk in the introduction about this one tweet that I certainly took note of from Asma Nizami, that, it's really cool, as she writes, how we went from learning how to make banana bread to learning how to abolish the police in weeks. And, there's some interesting reflections on what that sort of symbolized, that tweet. Obviously, it's the second anniversary, as it were, of George Floyd's death at the hands of police. And there is now a lot of media attention around where movements are at for abolition. And so, the thing that you say about that tweet and the moment that it marked of a sudden transition is that it was impressive that people could, quote, switch gears from isolation baking to insurrection. But it also, as you say, gets at how seamless the transition to collective learning and action can be when the moment is ripe. And there's this notion that the book itself it grows out of a groundswell of community action. And so, yeah, I mean, it's and I kind of want to come back to that question of the seamlessness of the transition and the groundwork that was already established for this moment to seemingly come out of nowhere. But where are you in terms of reflecting on what felt like the genesis of this book and the genesis of, a growing kind of even mainstream discussion around abolition?
It's a really important time, I think, to be reflecting on this question of where we're at, since for many, I think the spark of abolition was lit with George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. But the book, I think, tells a really local story about that movement for abolition and how the eruption wasn't as seamless as it might have seemed on the surface. Here in Toronto, we had been planning for a gathering called the Abolition Convergence that was supposed to be held in May 2020, but was obviously canceled in the first wave of COVID. And what was so remarkable about that organizing is that we started 2 years before the conference. And the intention was that we weren't just going to try to get everyone together for hot takes on abolition, but that we were going to approach the organizing itself as an opportunity to build trust and solidarity and understanding across movements between the organizers. And so for 2 years, we sat at tables every couple of weeks with people who were involved in fighting migrant detention, fighting for sex worker rights, fighting for Indigenous sovereignty, fighting for housing and shelter, anti-poverty, and labor movements, and so many other movements that had identified the failures of police reform and accountability movements, and also identified historically the roots of policing and prisons in different efforts across time towards social control. for various ends. And we all sat at those tables together for so long that when the conference was canceled, it wasn't the end of the movement for us. It wasn't the end of the effort. It was really the beginning of a reformulation of what that movement would look like. And so quite quickly, we came back together, and Kevin Walby suggested, why don't we try to do a book project? And part of that came out of the conversations around abolition sparked by the murder of George Floyd were, in the Canadian context, were quite readily dismissed as a copycat movement that was just borrowing from the politics of American activists and trying to apply them here in a context where it didn't fit. And so because we had been doing this work for a couple of years and we already had the network in place, we reached out to people and said, is anyone interested in putting together a collection that shows what abolition looks like on these lands? And quickly people added other people, and the network grew from the, small sort of pod that initiated the thread. And over the course of around a year, sort of people came in and dropped out based on their capacity. But what we ended up with is a really vibrant example of the kinds of struggles across Canada that are abolitionist. And so this is kind of a local expression of how that movement building was already in place.
Yeah, it really marks that that specific history, right? The recognition of a legacy of social control on these lands, now called Canada. Chapter 9 by Free Lands, Free Peoples talks about a carceral continuum in this country, from residential schools to prisons, and how they've informed and co-constituted one another. We can kind of jump into it, but Elene and Chanelle, did you want to follow up at all on what Shiri was saying?
Yeah, I think I just want to add this book is very important because this is not the book only for reading, but I think this is a very important tools as a part of movement. And I think this is very important too. I think a lot of people draw the attention is because they see the violence on the screen. But I think this book also uncover a lot of systematic violence from police and criminalization and policing not only carry out by the physical violence, but that is the huge violence actually we need to address. And I think this is also very, very important for this book.
It speaks to what Shiri was saying around just, not about collecting hot takes. It's about trying to build itself, like as a text, or inspire trust and solidarity in opposition to injustice. And on that point, I think, on page 113 of the book, the Sex Workers of Winnipeg Action Coalition is literally providing a list of 6 steps for community-led defunding efforts, right? Those tools. And it's doing so in opposition to what they call the city of Winnipeg's, quote, cowardice in failing to control the expansion of the police department. So there's this specific language of mobilization for political courage that is being both documented and modeled in the book. And so, I'm interested in kind of talking about the political pragmatism that exists in the book, how it attempts to, embody that need for radical care and what you call relational accountability instead of just like endless reform. I think this is a little bit rooted to the idea that abolition is somehow inherently just a negative or purely critical project rather than having some kind of vision. But you're also, trying to counter what you say is this dominant perception of the movement for abolition, that it does represent a certain naivete or disconnection from reality. Where have you encountered that, and how do you counter that? Maybe to Chanelle this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when we've talked about this book in our chapter before, we recently spoke in a class, and Shiri and Elaine will remember one of the first questions we got was from a student who said, well, something like abolition is so pragmatic, but and so, and we were all really delighted by the question because it really depends on your point of view whether you consider abolition pragmatic or not. I consider it to be incredibly, exceedingly pragmatic. I mean, it's, it's kind of like, I think of the police as having a boot on the neck of marginalized communities. And all you're doing is starting by taking the boot off the neck. It is very obvious that it's hard to fix problems. It's hard to address the root causes of any social problems under the conditions of police, social control, violence, kind of the economic exploitation of policing, where all of our community wealth is stolen and poured into these systems of policing. And so it's actually just really practical to just, something like defunding. Just stop pouring billions of dollars into a murderous system that doesn't fix social problems and causes them. That's really not rocket science. And then free up the possibilities of actually addressing social problems. And when you talk about, your question mentioned something about abolition being seen as a negative thing. And I think that's why so many people are referring back to this quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who says, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions, right? So we stop the bleeding. That's kind of like just, reducing the power and the size, the scope and the budgets of policing is just like putting a tourniquet on. You stop the damage and harm that institution is causing. Pause on that so that we have the capacity to build the institutions that we need that actually do affirm life. To me, I can't think of anything more practical.
Absolutely. I personally agree. And of course, I'm not playing devil's advocate by any means. I'm just sort of summoning the carceral logics that are, that erect a wall against these transformative solutions that, as you say, might stop the bleeding.
Exactly. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah. The police are the wall against what we need. And my declarative tone is just the way I speak. It's not that I thought you were playing devil's advocate.
Sure.
It's just how I speak.
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think to counter this wall of ideology, you're invoking the experience of so many of your contributors, and to me, that's like very different from purely abstract engagements with abolition. You say in the introduction that you hope your mix of methods is effective at communicating the urgency of abolition, and that speaks to the fact that you are providing people with theoretical tools as well. Do you feel like you got that mixture of like evidence-based, theoretical, and experiential methods as right as you could? And how did that sort of come into being? I guess I'm asking this to you, Shiri, as the sort of editor of the volume.
Yeah, well, let me just say, I think all the editors are pretty unanimous in disavowing any kind of like claims to the actual intellectual labor of the book. We really felt like administrators just sending the emails and reminding people of deadlines. So I feel like anyone could also answer this question. But I also think, what Chanelle and Elene's chapter demonstrates, as well as all the others, is that there's these false binaries between theoretical, intellectual, and practical work that I think every single chapter demonstrates. And I think that's why, I agree with Elene that it's an important book for its uniqueness right now on abolition in Canada, because it really speaks from the intellectual and experiential context across movements. And I think this is where the theory is generated. I think for sure some people may have more historical knowledge about different aspects of the movement, different experiential knowledge about histories of movements, debates, discussions, tensions, and so on. But I really think that is the really, really important work of abolition. It's to recognize the intellectual and experiential contributions of people who are most impacted by police violence and by the prison system, and to learn from them about what the alternatives could look like, how people are fighting from within, what kind of support and solidarity is critical across movements and within movements. And I think that's the kind of methodological contribution that the book makes from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. To kind of build from that, there is this, again, to maybe come back to the first thing I mentioned, there is this sense really conveyed very emphatically in the book that there's a deep sort of debt, I suppose, or a continuum of sort of liberatory politics that you're drawing from too. And it's that thing that made abolition, as you say, so legible so quickly and widely during the summer of 2020, making, it's not like this book is, again, about like these completely novel takes on not trying to kind of intervene in that way. It's instead like trying to itself build on Black feminist organizers and scholars in the United States, you say, and you mentioned Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Certainly Angela Davis was just making this point recently in a Haymarket Roundtable. And I guess, politically, why was it so important to make it clear that this movement for defunding and dismantling the police was not new and not a fad? Why was that so important to emphasize from any of your points of view?
I could take the first approach to answering the question, which is, I think this book, one of the things that makes this book really rich is reading through it. You have a really, really deeply entrenched analysis across almost every single contribution that understands anti-colonial abolition movements to be an integral part of critiques against police and prisons in this country. And I think that anti-colonial abolition critique is interwoven and intersecting across the chapters with anti-racist analysis, but also a particular analysis of what anti-Blackness looks like in this country. And so I really think the way that abolition is historicized so important, because it's kind of an indigenous, and I mean that in the kind of generic sense of indigenous, like specific to place here, analysis of abolition that is quite different, not necessarily in terms of like denying the conjoined genocides in the United States of enslavement and abolition, but in terms of their expression, articulation, the particular like historical configuration of enslavement and genocide, and migrant labor and violence and so on, racism in this country, they're different. They have different expressions and different histories. And I think in Disarm, Defund, and Dismantle, there's a kind of there's an interesting and specific historicization of abolition that's, I think, important to pay attention to. And in many ways, I think the analysis of anti-colonial abolition has informed people's understanding of white supremacy across other movements as well. And likewise, the kinds of racism that we're seeing across society today are really informed in turn by histories of migrant labor and the ongoing racial immigration policies and labor policies that continue to inform Canadian society.
To just sort of quickly underline something you said, like this idea that there is an anti-colonial abolitionist critique that kind of flows through the book and then like back through the history that precedes the book. Abolition is a term that is meant to specifically echo the abolition of slavery. That it, for that reason, is sort of almost unco-optable. There are ways in which even the language of revolution has been kind of co-opted by the capitalist state. Abolition resists that, I think.
Oh, do we have something to say about that?
Okay.
We do. Elaine and I, our whole chapter is actually, we don't talk about it at length in our chapter. Our chapter is really about why police abolition is so critical for migrant sex workers. And I think we make reference to briefly, but there's a whole thing that leftists in general don't know is happening, which is that the right-wing Christian and carceral feminists actually did co-opt the term abolition. They co-opted it back in the mid 1800s and then again picked it up again about 25 years ago. And they used that term to refer to the abolition of sex work.
Right.
And they call themselves abolitionists, and they name their organizations things like Free the Slaves. They refer to legislation that criminalizes sex work. They'll name it after Black abolitionists who fought for the freedom of enslaved Africans. Like and the thing is, I wish it was less co-optable. And a lot of our work is trying to take back the language of abolition and insist that it, again, I'm not saying anything that you're saying this, I just,
No. I appreciate
it's
it.
just
No.
me highly caffeinated. So I would love for the term to be, it's been an extremely racist co-optation because it was co-opted by a conservative, white, carceral, often Christian, this alliance between conservative American politics, evangelical churches, and carceral white feminists who have created an alliance to use the language of abolition because they consider sex work and specifically prostitution to be a form of slavery.
Right.
And then view their work to outlaw it, to criminalize it as abolition. And it's really unfortunate. And so a lot of the work we do is bridging between sex workers' movements that face criminalization in the name of quote unquote like a fake abolition and real actual abolitionist movements. Elaine, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think this is like what you say. We can see it really is a project. We call it like anti-trafficking industry, that how they work together to uphold the white supremacy, how they use the language of abolitionists to draw a lot of support, no matter funding, to justify the violence that they keep increasing, policing, increasing criminalization. And of course, we know that how racialized people, marginalized people are being targeted. And I think this is important for this book is because it's not only having that abstract discussion. And I think we are really appreciate that this also have a lot of contributors from sex worker community, because sex worker is often the target of criminalization and policing, and then to know about what is actually happen on the ground, and then how different grassroots organization is contribute in the concrete suggestion what mean defund police, what mean abolitionists. And I think this is a very important, as you say, that this book have the abstract piece, but I think this is also very important to have this like a practical, concrete information for the reader.
Mm-hmm. It's this like beautiful motile like thing, this book, and it does I'm constantly having to step back and realize how little I actually understand about the movement for abolition, for police abolition. It's not reducible to these kind of easy phrases like claiming that it's like unco-optable. Even a term as seemingly radical as this can be misused and abused. And yeah, so we can kind of jump ahead to your chapter in some sense, because you are taking aim at anti-trafficking laws, but I think tactically, and it does seem like it's a question of inventing and then reinventing the tactics. Like that appeal is kind of tricky in the sense that one might assume the quote unquote average Canadian is not going to disagree with these laws that putatively try to prevent human trafficking. Like, it's a horror that induces this like spontaneous fear in people. And it's so like, it's within that space that abolition gets co-opted, in particular, this idea that the world is this inherently dangerous place that requires carceral measures to control it. But the thing you're trying to expose in your piece is this idea that it is, in fact, carceral thinking and carceral policies that produce many of the dangers that exist, especially for racialized people and people at the economic margins. So could you just like explain what is what you argue in your piece, what's basically inherently harmful about the model of anti-trafficking, and why it needs to be dismantled and abolished in favor of preserving the rights of sex workers?
I think why this chapter is so important is really show the harm of the anti-trafficking movement. And it's not only the law, but whole mechanism, whole giant mechanism with tons of funding, tons of like police power, and tons of involvement of NGO, because they are using the name of rescue and helping and using the language of abolitionists. They're using the language of human rights to make the people think this is a good thing and cannot resist it, and make the resistance of it is more difficult, because they use anti-trafficking as the name to cover the real agenda is actually criminalization, is like anti-migrant, is racist, is anti-sex work. So that is make them become so success because they can draw so much support by cover their real agenda. And I think what we really want to do with this book is one is we really want to show the harm. This is not the unintended harm. What we always heard from now many anti-trafficking organizations, they say, oh, this is unintended harm, how we can reduce unintended harm by bringing the police. But this is the system, this is the movement, this is the policy to decide to control and oppress and certain people, particular racialized migrant and sex workers. So that's I think this is very important for this chapter, is really try to solve the problem of the anti-trafficking movement, including the law. The law is one big part that give the power of law enforcement, and but more is important to make the people think behind why we think the anti-trafficking movement is the good thing, and when they actually do the harm, and why the sex worker voice is keep being like silent. So for example, now they are shutting down all the massage parlor in Newmarket, and then they say this is protect the woman. How you can protect the woman by taking away the job, right? And then how you can protect the woman by bringing the police in everyday life of the worker, when the police is the major violence of the sex worker, and of course different sex worker, but you see how racialized and migrant is the target, including trans, right? That they are the target of long history of target of policing, and they now to use it to justify. So, and I don't know if you realize the recent funding, like every month you can see the news, like $8 million to send to Naga for police to anti-trafficking work to rescue and protect the woman. You don't see a lot of like a pushback, right? Because they are using the name,
Right.
and by anti-trafficking movement, the police can become the hero, can become the rescuer, and this saver narrative is really covered they are the agent of imposing the oppression and violence, and yeah.
Yeah, it becomes this shield against sort of identifying police abuses of power, this like, powerful narrative of heroism, this glorification of police. Chanelle, did you want to extend that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you mentioned, like, is the average Canadian really going to think twice about human trafficking laws? I think there's a couple things there. The first is most people don't really know what's in these laws, and they don't know how they're enforced. And we're going up against, like you said, the kind of the ways that we have been trained to have a viscerally emotional reaction to the idea of human trafficking, which associates it with sex work, but particularly with racialized sex workers and migrant sex workers. And what we're really, this is part of why we wanted to be in this book and why it's so amazing that there are multiple sex worker perspectives in this book. And the editors just did such a great job at not tokenizing sex worker movements, but really lifting up sex worker movements as both, like Shiri said, like I don't remember exactly how you put it, Shiri, but basically like it's kind of both frontline, like highlighting, frontline community defense against policing, and at the same time lifting up the theoretical and political knowledge that comes from that work. And we wanted to be in that conversation with other leftists and abolitionists, and because to expand the solidarity between sex worker, migrant justice, and abolitionist movements, so that those understandings and that pushback against human trafficking law we can build power. We need to build power against the anti-trafficking industry, and we need solidarity to do that. And will the average Canadian understand it at this point? Some do. Mm-hmm. Some do. Mostly just because people, I think one of the most important things for people to understand about the anti-trafficking industry is just that it's policing. It's just policing. And so if you know a little bit about policing, then you might have a better, be more likely to question whether or not it's capable of actually protecting people, and especially whether it's really capable of protecting, low income and racialized women in the sex industry. Of course it's not, right? It's there to control and punish. It's not there to protect. I think I'll just leave it there.
And I think you make that point so convincingly in the article. Like, you move from political demands to examples of harm, and then back to these profound political demands, like again, extending it into like the broader need to kind of decarcerate, to end mass incarceration, but also, sort of expunge carceral thinking. The thing I wanted to pick up on, though, is this this question of, like, I guess, the average Canadian, which is never a real thing. It's just this figure that gets invoked for various political ends, I think. And yet, like, there are studies that try to gauge sort of public opinion. The Wortley report, for example, that was written here in or about policing in Halifax, revealed a lot of division around, who believes the police are there providing an essential function, and who believe that, the police are prone to abuses of power, are overfunded, and so on. And while there was that division, what was really interesting was that there was like almost a unanimous sense that the police primarily protect the wealthy, that there was like obvious gaps in terms of distribution of harm and provision of support and safety, depending on like where you come from economically. And so, I mean, like, I think we can pick up on that and sort of think about how, gentrification plays a role in this process of decriminalization. So in the essay by Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project, they explain that the capitalist state, quote, seizes these opportunities to tear our buildings down and create supposedly better planned, more gentrified spaces. This is, as they say, quote, displacement framed as neighborhood improvement. Again, something that's like difficult perhaps to sort of argue against, because like the idea is we all want to live in these like beautiful, creative, buzzworthy like spaces of gentrified improvement, so called. But as a means of thinking about abolition in this space, and equality, radical equality, equity in these spaces, I wondered if you could like expand on the idea that, as Ellie Kerr and Jenny Duffy write, there is, quote, no meaningful resistance to police violence, racial capitalism, and the carceral state that excludes sex workers. Why do you think these struggles, against the kind of moralistic condemnation of sex work and the sort of more like, I guess, explicitly economic argument against gentrification need to be like connected here.
So for me, that I think you use the term like average Canadian. So I think every time when I hear this word, I feel so uncomfortable. Like, who are these average Canadian?
Mm-hmm.
Who are the voice being heard? Who are the voice being excluded? And I think this is how related to this like white supremacy and capitalism, and then certain people is designed in this system continues to better off, maintain the power, maintain their money, resources, including the land, right? So, and I think police is taking a very important role, continues to use violence that to exclude the people, right? So for example, the people in the park, why homeless people cannot use the park, and by framing then in certain way that they can be evicted, same as the massage parlor, that they often being called as like see as outsider, they need to get rid of city no matter say they are the traffic victim or illegal, same as the street-based sex worker that and also drugs use people that they are being perceived as the harm of the community instead of like parts of the community, because behind that who are the wealth they are protecting, right? So, and I think that is very dangerous when we like often use the term like average Canadian. So that is what we see is so often this kind of message is to justify the oppression that particularly those people like migrant, racialized and marginalized, including like the LGBTQ community, their voice is not being heard. And then so that's why the gentrification projects like that, when they change the name, become a city improvement, right? Same as like the rate of the sex worker now become rescue of the traffic victim, then to justify, but actually it's the same thing, right? But then it's like they make so-called average Canadian really buy it, because when you say so-called average Canadian, that they are the influential in mainstream media, they have also very strong, like many of them also have very strong like anti-migrant agenda or anti-sex work, or like even like racist agenda. They may not able to explicitly say that, but when this kind of campaign, or like this kind of, I keep calling this like project, like coming in, so that they are so easy to buy in because they have like so many thing allies. I think I have discussed with Chanelle why this white feminist is so can connect with this white very like racist oppressive politician and with the church, why they are coming together so well, because of course they are coming together to continue to maintain the power and wealth of certain people, right? And of course this is like that the white middle class people, and they hold this moralistic value.
I think that's what makes your chapter so essential, is that it is making these connections clear and felt. And it's like using intersectionality, but not just as this kind of like, fashionable concept. Like it's making clear how the social reality of intersecting oppressions needs to be seen and felt and experienced as a frame for questioning how comfortably the media, for example, will invoke that figure of the average Canadian in order to just further marginalize those that, do occupy that intersectional like subjectivity or identity. I want to switch gears in a second and talk about Shiri, your chapter, Canada is a Bad Company, in a second. But I guess just to kind of stay on that thread, Elaine, of thinking about white feminism. Your article talks about feminist organizations, specifically like the YWCA and the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, and how they are in fact implicated in the perpetuation of harm. But the article expresses this like disappointment and anger with those organizations. Like it's clear that you really you feel it very deeply. This like outrage or even like incredulity of like, why is it that you're so in collusion? Why are these particular feminist organizations like the YWCA and the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies so attached to their own kind of like relationship of, I guess, mutual benefit with the police. I mean, like, you should kind of expect more perspective and commitment from those groups, but they don't seem to be almost like capable of it. What would it take for them to kind of like come to terms with their own complicity with the criminalization of sex work? And what are the historical roots of that maybe prevent that like realization?
Let me start by saying that there are really long historical roots between social work and what I would say is actually racist white feminism. I think that's sort of the missing piece sometimes when we talk about white feminism. It's not just white women doing feminism, it's an institution, the institutionalization of a white supremacist version of feminism. And there's, I feel like there's a lot of people who could speak to the history of social work as being an institution that developed out of anti-Blackness and colonialism, that empowered white women to have outsized power and control over the intimate and family lives of Black and Indigenous people, over the ways, the family forms, the way of living, I mean, everything, gender, sexuality. And that's the institution of social work is just inextricably connected to white supremacy in Canada and the US. And so I think in our chapter, yes, we're angry about it. We're kind of amazed. I think what we're amazed by is that there has been such a broad pushback on the role of policing in the lives of poor and working class and racialized women that what's surprising is that pushback hasn't moved for so many organizations and so many women in social service organizations, that hasn't moved and necessarily moved their approach to the criminalization of sex work, even though sex workers are almost entirely marginalized women and queer people. They're poor, working class, women of color, Black Indigenous women, migrants, trans, drug users, single mothers. Like, though that's, sex workers are marginalized women and queer people. And so I think it's not surprising that there's, the social sector views, it takes a very kind of racist and classist view of sex workers. What's surprising is that the sector hasn't challenged itself more around the criminalization of sex work, given that it is questioning the role of policing in women's lives increasingly. I think that's what I would say. And I'm interested in both Elene and Shiri, your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I think I want to add, of course, this is angry. Why I am so angry, why people need to be angry is because on the one hand, they keep saying that how they uphold the rights of women, how they really care about the women, particularly Elizabeth Fry, they are doing the work to support the people in prison. And then so they keep talking about the harm, how criminalization is harming the woman. But on the other hand, they are the major lobbyer to criminalize sex work and to put sex worker, and many of them are women, into the prison. And at that process, they benefit a lot. They got tons of funding for continues to support the women in prison. On the other hand, they also get a lot of exiting funding to force the sex worker to exit the sex work. So this is no different with the conversion therapy, like before they make the people to change the gender. And we need to know social work actually is important agent to exercise the state power in the name of helping, as Chanelle say, the house social work through CAS, house social work through immigration service, that they change the people lifestyle to certain way, of course, is the white middle class value, right? So for example, other example is how the policing go to people everyday life. They have a lot of parental program, that how they use it to put that colonialized idea of how children should be raised, how CAS become the agent. Particularly we see how much Black and Indigenous community in the CAS system. So this is people know how it's harmful of the residential school, but then actually what the child welfare system is doing still the same, right? They don't put people in residential school now, but they still put people in shelter or like in other kind of like childcare facility. Actually is the nature is the same, still try to control and maintain the power. Of course sex work is still also the place they often police, and when we look at those organization, how they benefit from that. And also we see, particularly related to anti-trafficking movement, how so many new organization by these so-called feminists and get huge funding continues maintain and promote this moralistic idea and promote this policing. And many of them, when you see who are they, and many of them, they got so much awarded and become human rights defender. And we see how so many celebrity love to join this movement because this is so much like social asset they can gain. We say anti-trafficking movement, anti-sex work movement is everyone benefit except sex worker, right? So like police, law enforcement, politician become the hero, and this feminists, I don't call them feminists actually. I they love police more than the woman, so they give power to the police, and prison not give power to the woman. They are not the real feminists in my eyes.
I haven't heard that point made very often, that even calling them carceral feminists is giving them sort of too much credit in some sense. Like they don't earn that.
Yeah, it's like calling people who want to criminalize abortion pro-life. We know they're not pro-life. They couldn't be less pro-life. They couldn't be more pro-death.
Absolutely.
Right? But they refer to themselves as feminists or women's advocates, but they're willing to sacrifice women. So I think, yes, that should disqualify them from the term feminist. If you believe in the criminalization of sex work, and that's all anti-trafficking legislation is, I don't think people know that anti-trafficking legislation does nothing else except criminalize sex work. There's nothing in it that is novel, right? There's nothing in an anti-trafficking law or policy that isn't covered by other laws and policies, which aren't effective, right? But we've already got laws against sexual assault or, any abduction or physical assault or labor exploitation. The only thing that happens in an anti-trafficking policy is to criminalize sex work, and that criminalizes sex workers. There's no way to do sex work without falling in violation of the law. People in these social service organizations, and an organization like Elizabeth Fry or YWCA that provide services to women who've been through the criminal legal system would know that. A lot of people wouldn't know that, but if you are working in community with women who have had contact with the law and with police, you know that they are exposed to harm as a result of laws that criminalize sex work. And I think, that's like Elene was saying, that's where some of the horror and outrage comes from our quote unquote feminist allies who are on the wrong side and not fighting to pull these laws off of women's lives.
Yeah, I may use one of example. So we have a member of Butterfly. She had been living very well, and she do sex work and sometimes support other sex worker. As because of sex work is being criminalized, when you help other sex worker to answer the phone, help to book the appointment, so that it's all being criminalized. So that what happens is when the woman get charges, all her money being taken away, she lost her home and lost even the phone, tablet, everything, have nothing. And then they're being flown out on the street. And then it's the criminalization, is the law and police make them become so vulnerable, and they get charged, they need to go to the prison, and then so they need to seek help from this organization that they got tons of funding, and then but for the sex workers, sometimes they cannot get the resources, or they may need to rely on this organization to give them the support in order to support them to navigate in this criminal system. So this is the example that how they create a problem and benefit from that, and make the sex worker be marginalized and need to rely on the system. Other example is a sex worker get raped and her phone being taken away, and then there is a very caring social worker say, "Oh, what, I can help you, I can give you a phone," and she was being taken all her money in an expensive phone, and then this social worker give her a shitty phone. What does it mean? So and then but they bring in the social work to justify this system, and justify this, same as like now many people say they need to ask like instead of calling police, that calling social worker, and that's calling social worker to work together with police. And I think bringing social work do not make the police work be more just, less harmful. And so, and also how the NGO keep producing number of human trafficking that support those policing and machine. We have talked to tons of social service provider, and I think one chapter also have done a research with the social service provider because of the funding driven. Many of them have been serving homeless people, sex workers for a very long time, but now they need to shape all the story, become like a human trafficking in order to gain the funding or maintain the funding. So, but then it's like they keep support like the bubble, there's moral panic and the fake statistic of human trafficking to support those like all human anti-trafficking initiatives. So including increased policing, including like extensive increase of funding for law enforcement.
There's this whole apparatus. It sounds like that is difficult to move. It's difficult to reshape, and yet you're obviously determined to do that work because of your direct experience. And it is astonishing that there are these organizations that witness violence directly and still are not changed. That exists in Canada. There's an article in the book by Julius Haig that writes about this like Canadian myth of tolerance, nonviolence, and civility, and a national exceptionalism that represents, as Julius puts it, a denial of difference. There's this like myth of benevolence in Canada that is clearly in contradiction with the growth in police expenditures. Again, I'm quoting the article, police expenditures despite a declining crime rate. It seems very hard to expose it in Canada because of this like mythology that exists. I mean, like, like in the face of actual like spikes in anti-Indigenous violence, spikes in violence against communities of color, there's still this kind of resilient mythology, and I guess to connect it to the Nova Scotian context. There's another fantastic piece in the book by Freelance Free Peoples that I gestured to earlier, where they talk about how, quote, settler lay people act to both trigger and enforce the criminalization of Indigenous people. In the same way that there are intersecting oppressions, I think this piece is sort of identifying that there are intersecting and overlapping kind of white supremacist empowerments and sources of privilege that seep into Canadian society. And they're saying like so-called settler lay people are deeply complicit with the spike in like white vigilantism that has been directed, for example, at Mi'kmaq communities here in Nova Scotia. Ardath, why not talk to me about this kind of normalization of like unauthorized enforcement in these kind of under-policed South Shore communities where, a lobster fishery was burned down and the RCMP knew in advance that it was going to take place. The police were actually complicit in the violence there. And I wondered, Shiri, if you could come in here and sort of address that section of the text, maybe in relationship to your contribution, like the idea that settler lay people are part of the perpetuation of anti-Indigenous racist policing. Like, something like the Freedom Convoy comes to mind too, this like white supremacist far right fringe. Any thoughts on how the quote unquote average citizen, which is this kind of coded white supremacist figure, participates in the violence that that persists in in the form of anti-Indigenous racism?
I think this is a really excellent point about the abolition of police, because it also connects with Chanelle and Elene's article around identifying the agents of violence against sex workers that include bylaw officers as well. So it's not always strictly police officers. There's a whole class of people who are deputized to enforce white supremacy in this country. In the case of Indigenous people, there's also an interesting parallel between the deputization of white settlers and the deputization of what Du Bois called small whites in the era of Reconstruction in the United States, where at this moment post-emancipation, when freed Black people had so much in common in terms of worker oppression within the growth of capitalism, there was so much opportunity for alliance between the white working classes and the freed Black people. It was a moment when the so-called, what he calls the small whites, chose to identify with the white owning classes in a move of racial alliance over working class alliance. And similarly in Canada, you can see this massive identification of working class white people with white owning classes as a way of defending a white supremacist foundation of this country that's really grounded in property rights. And the bigger threat to white people over capitalism in some sense, even though it's definitely working against their interests, is the threat against their private property. You can see this in too many cases of violence against Indigenous people in Mi'kmaq, but also in the prairie provinces, where, of course, Colton Boushie was killed when Gerald Stanley was defending his property, or more recently in a case unfolding of violence against two Métis hunters during COVID who were trying to provide for their families and were murdered by white people protecting their lands, allegedly or supposedly, or that's how they're framing it. All of these cases show that the defense of property against Indigenous people is really what I think shores up this white supremacist power.
Yeah, I mean, and there's this new article. It makes me think of this article that just came out recently in the Narwhal by Matt Simmons that chronicles these extensive connections between extractive industries, energy companies, and the RCMP, which is about encroachment for the purpose of like resource development. You're quoted, Shiri, in that article as saying that there's this love triangle that exists between Coastal GasLink, RCMP, and the BC provincial government. So that's an extensive level of complicity. And like even more pointedly, I think you say that, quote, there's so much mystery to unpack about the authorization of these pipelines. This is what your chapter is exploring. Canada is a bad company, mm-hmm. where you write that in the country now called Canada, there are, quote, property laws that claim to override centuries of Indigenous tenure and criminal laws that we're supposed to assume supersede Indigenous jurisdiction. But you're obviously trying to push against those assumptions when you ask the question, what is the difference between being above the law or an enforcer of law if your role is to uphold a colonial legal order invented to justify dispossession? So you're positioning yourself in your essay as a person who I think advocates for land back, for this for sovereignty, and maybe even more radically, like the dissolution of property rights, the questioning of it. You've written elsewhere on the destructive effects of extractivism and the challenge that Indigenous sovereignty poses to the settler states. Just huge investment in energy in this country. Could you maybe speak to your feelings about being included in that Narwhal article, what you were trying to accomplish and framing it the way that you did, and I guess relatedly what you're trying to do in the chapter?
Yeah, I'll try to make it. I'll try to make it clear. It's a complex kind of historical argument that looks at the relationship between colonization, extraction, and police. But it's not that complicated in the sense that the continuities are clear. In the Narwhal article that you quote, there's a relationship of collaboration between these different parties that are all hand in glove to remove Indigenous people from the path of development and extraction on their territories. But I think to draw the line all the way back, this is not an anomaly or a question of illegal practices. I don't think that the point for me, anyways, is to say there's malfeasance here because there's this collaboration between these parties. My point in the chapter for the book is to say this is the blueprint of our country. And the example that I give is the establishment of the Hudson Bay Company through a land grant from the King of England to Cousin Rupert, which granted Rupert's land, which is essentially a third of the whole country today, current boundaries, in order to have exclusive hunting, trapping, trading rights for Hudson Bay Company. This is the lands of the Innu, the Inuit, the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Assiniboine, the Ojibwe, the Gwich'in, the Dene, and so on. These are unceded lands that were granted, by this charter to a company, and the company precedes the country of Canada. So in some sense, there already was juridical powers allotted to a private company to enforce law and to govern the territory. And then those lands were sold to Canada in 1868 for 300,000 British pounds. What were they selling?
Yeah.
A stolen land that was chartered to the king's cousin. And when the land sale went through, the Métis rebelled. They rose up in arms saying, you can't sell lands that aren't yours to own. We have territorial authority over this land. And it delayed the sale of Rupert's land for an additional year, and then was settled with the Métis, and then later, enforced in really antithetical ways to the original agreement through British police forces, military forces. And then that pattern continued across the prairies, where the Northwest Mounted Police were mounted, the predecessors to the RCMP were mounted in order to enforce treaty deals across the country. And of course, each of these is specific, and it's not to dismiss the validity of these treaties, but from the Crown's perspective, the treaties were important in order to clear the land for settlement. And so this relationship between the clearing of lands for CN Rail, for colonization companies, for private settlers, the Hudson Bay Company got a huge amount of assets and land through the deal. And the negotiators of those deals were often also on the boards of these private companies. The foundation of the country is really based on that quixotic love triangle between the police, private companies, and Canadian government and provincial governments. And so it's not an accident that right now you're seeing the collaboration, the intense collaboration between a pipeline company, government, and police forces in order to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. We have quite a bit of practice in that area.
No, absolutely. And I think it's just this revoltingly violent, infuriating history that, if you tell it, it's just if you tell it in the way that you're telling it, it reveals this matrix of oppression that persists into the present. And I want to come back, Elene and Chanelle, to the question of how laws are similarly oppressive in the space of sex work, but to just stay on this point a little longer, the essay that you've written, Shiri, talks about the use of injunctions as a legal tool. You say that almost invariably very little evidence is needed to win these cases, You hardly even have to prove a case. You say almost 100% of injunctions filed against First Nations by corporations and governments involve resource extraction or development, and they have an over 80% success rate at obtaining them, which rises to 90% when provinces seek them. I just recently attended a webinar where I asked Anne Spice, an Indigenous critical theorist and organizer, about the instruments that might exist to like resist the legal definition of land, this sort of doctrine of discovery, as something that can just be taken from, rather than, something sacred and necessary for survival. I asked about like revoking terra nullius. But what was interesting is like, Spice is involved in these frontline struggles. And so she's like insisting on tactics of resistance that will work now. And she talked about like intervening at the sort of survey and permit stages to interrupt extraction projects by just like focusing on revoking crown title as the sort of legal embodiment of terra nullius. In relation to this, I wonder if you could expand on like why it's so hard to strike down these injunctions, to fight against them. You talk in the article about like the financial harm that corporations are able to cite and how it's like it's hard for Indigenous communities to sort of cite similar harms. Spice is talking about kind of inventing strategies for making those harms apparent to a legal system that is unjust. Why is it important to understand these logics sort of in historical context, and what do you think can be done?
To bring this back to Elene's point about who the Canadian citizen is that's represented often in abstract legal definitions of Canadian citizenship, the de facto assumptions behind injunctions and the reason why corporations can get them so handily is partly because of the way that harm is defined. And that harm is defined in a very classic capitalist definition of disruptions to potential profit, losses, employment, and so on. And so in terms of the injunction research that you cited, I led that work at the Yellowhead Institute for our land back report. And we had been hearing, for so long about the way that injunctions, as Art Manuel called them, were the legal billy club against Indigenous people. What's really important to note about the effectiveness of injunctions is that injunctions started to become more prevalent and more successful for corporations and governments exactly at a time when Indigenous people started to win constitutional recognition for treaty and Aboriginal rights. And what happened was the courts started saying, oh, well, now you need to go and litigate these rights in the courts. Like, we can't deal with this at the injunction level, which is just an emergency sort of stopgap lever to pull if some emergency, measure needs to be taken before an actual trial can unfold. And so in those court proceedings that have unfolded since 1982 to determine Aboriginal rights and title have been extremely expensive, extremely costly, extremely lengthy. And so the courts are undermining all of that jurisprudence and court and case law around Aboriginal rights and title, and just determining Aboriginal rights based on whether they constitute irreparable harm or balance of convenience, which are the injunction tests. And so I think another person who was on that panel that you talked about was Irina Sarek, who I've been working with really closely on injunctions as well. And, I think Anne Spice is absolutely correct, which in her assessment that what underlies the success of injunctions is this prevalence to favor economic harm in the form of financial harm, but it's also the fact that that kind of harm is premised on the sanctity of property rights, which kind of underlies the possibility of people making profit, is that they can prove that they're entitled to it through their property rights, which include their permits and licenses and so on. And so underlying the injunction and the success of the injunction is this fabrication of crown title. And, the Hudson Bay Charter is just one example of how that title was fabricated. But underlying this whole country is the mythology of underlying crown title. So I would say, just as a last point, that, anti-colonial abolition perspectives have a sort of tagline that you could say, which is, no foreign law on Indigenous lands. That it's not just about the police or prisons, it's the imposition of a settler system of law onto people who never ceded or surrendered or gave up their governance systems, their inherent legal systems, their social and cultural systems. So the prison system isn't just about like, oh, there's a disproportionate amount of Indigenous people in prisons. Why is that? It's like, no, why is that law being applied to Indigenous people at all? It calls the entire apparatus of the state into question. And police and prisons are just one really central form of criminalization that continues to remove Indigenous people from their lands. So it's in continuity with other forms of containment, like residential schools and the reserve system, and now, of course, injunctions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, this kind of carceral continuum that encloses the other, as it were, the Indigenous other, and the life worlds that still exist, even if the Canadian state wants to almost romanticize them as a thing of the past, like asserting that. I don't want to take too much more of your time. You've all been so generous with it, and with your ideas. But I do want to maybe come back to Chanelle and Elene and ask about sort of how you are building the tools for these forms of resistance against, very powerful legal structures, but also, I guess, how you approach like building trust and solidarity within the movement, where there is like all this outrage that you have to risk, they have to confront in order to even like make progress. One of the things you mentioned earlier, Elaine, is the role of like NGOs, which are sort of this like professionalized version, I suppose, of activist organizing that you're saying can kind of work counter to social justice and liberation in a lot of ways. You talk about you both talk about your experience of being like basically intimidated at this national forum on human trafficking, where again, it was like clear that your radical support for sex workers and your solidarity with them was not going to be tolerated. And I found that story particularly striking in terms of like trying to build trust and solidarity in these spaces that shouldn't necessarily be hostile. So, I wondered if you could speak to that experience basically of being like angrily excluded as radical activists from the conversation, and what it reveals, I guess. Like, to what extent does that like existence, that persistence of like morality, allow NGOs to maintain this like hostility to radical politics?
So I think for me, when we talk about hostile, it's not on the individual level or like the just the NGO level. And I think I totally agree with like Sherry used to illustrate how the injunction, so that is the problem of the legal system. And we also need to know the police is the one execute carry out that legal system, so that we also need to understand the legal system in the way they are the very powerful tools to maintain the power and oppress. And so that's why when we look at policing, this is also necessary to look at the law and policy, and particularly for Asian migrant sex workers. So they are facing different kind of the law of oppression, like criminal law, immigration law, bylaw, all together. And of course, also family law. That's like to have this giant immigration law, everything come together to oppress. And then we also need to look at the policy making process, the how white supremacy play out in order to make the law maintain the power, and how the NGO is the active role involved in that. So that's why my hostile is not the attitude. what I really want to use the hostile we experience to really draw the attention for whole legal system, and all policy making process are also hostile. The hostile in the way is they keep excluding the voices of specific people. So for example, for migrant, they cannot pass the English test. No matter how many years they stay here, they cannot get the citizen. So this is a powerful way to exclude like racialized non-English people to have this political power, that to involve that they can be more influential in this policy making process. And in last few years, Butterfly have involved in like the lobbying of stopping the harmful anti-trafficking law like Bill 251, and also like this like anti-trafficking policy and criminalization of sex work, and also the bylaw. But this NGO often get a tons of funding, that they do this like so-called like continues to promote this moralistic agenda, but at the same time they are also important actor to lobby the policymaker to impose those harmful anti-trafficking policy. And that conference is like held by Canadian Women Foundation, so they were the active lobbyer to promote the criminalization of sex work, conflate sex work with human trafficking. And why we bought in that space is because there are some changes in the leadership, and also some changes of the organization. They think this is necessary to bring in the voices. But I think what I really want to see, how this NGO is so powerful, this white anti-sex work organization, they are working with the politicians. Sometimes when we go to the city meeting, they call them friends. And they are so hostile for this migrant. Even we have 300 workers went to City Hall, and our city staff say, no matter how many people you come, it's useless. And so that's why it's so important to have the allyship, because as racialized as the people don't speak English and marginalized sex worker, massage worker, the politicians do not hear the voice, and also the city staff do not hear the voice. So that's why it's so important to build the movement, to bring the people with different power, no matter lawyer, no matter those people have like economic, social status power together, and also build the solidarity of different movement. And instead of like seeing this issue as the allies to support this movement, how they see migrant issue as their own issue, how they see sex worker issue is part of the racial justice movement, how they see the sex worker issue is the anti-poverty movement. So one of the example is in Newmarket. Now they just changed the bylaw. Anyone, if they want to do massage, they need to get the credential from accredited institution. Again, this is a anti-migrant and racist policy. If you can't speak English, if you're not rich, you cannot get the credential. So this is the system that to make the white people continues can offer the massage, but the poor Asian, the non-English speaking people become illegal. Then they can bring in the law enforcement, right? But in the lobbying, that it's so difficult to disturb and change it. And so that's why Butterfly keep bringing the campaign to call for the racial justice organization, not come in with the movement as the ally, but how you see this policy is the racist issue that you also have responsibility to contribute and support. And same as the anti-trafficking movement, when you think you are the abolitionist, so that you need to know the anti-trafficking movement itself is pro-policing, pro-criminalization, pro-prison, is harmful for the woman, so that you also need to stand with the sex worker to push back the policy. But I think when we talk about allyship, it is very important to center the voice and having the leadership from the community to lead the movement to make it happen. And I think one of the very important work of Butterfly is keep bringing and building the allyship to see the intersectionality of this issue, and seeing what's the giant mechanism, white supremacy, racist and anti-migrant capitalists, homophobia, everything, operate together, so that to to join together to stop this machine and bring the real justice of the community.
Yeah, trying to make clear how the machine works and reach to the kind of roots of how it's operating, and articulate it for people. This is what your piece does in talking about the PCE-PA legislation that's been so detrimental to sex workers. And I see, connections to what Shiri was saying around, how these injunctions are in some ways a direct reaction to gains within Indigenous communities, claims to land. And you basically make it clear that this legislation was a reactionary piece of conservative legislation that really was designed to counteract the gains of sex workers. And so, I won't take too much more of your time, but I just want to thank you for kind of clarifying some of the claims of the book, which is incredibly insightful, but is fundamentally about, as Chanelle put it earlier, taking the boot off the neck and trying to address the problem by thinking radically about redistributing wealth, redistributing power, and making the sort of systemic edges of society visible in a system that demands and yet resists change, basically. So, any closing kind of thoughts that people wanted to share, though, before we sign off today?
I think this is really, really important to read the book, so they have different author and bring in different aspects with the and I think this is also important you share this book and also the voices, because we need to build the power to change, and we need more people know more about the problem of policing and criminal system and prison system, and we need to build this collective power together to make the change.
Yeah, I also just want to say I think it's a great book. Thanks, Scott, for having us on to talk about it. I think it's a great book for people who want to understand abolition, both within so-called Canada and outside, because I think that the book brings contributions to abolitionist movements and thinking that I haven't seen in other collections. So yeah, I really want to credit Shiri and the other authors for that.
Yeah, and I also want to add, because Shiri, this book chapter really inspired me, and Chanelle continues to write more, because we cannot include so many things in this book chapter, so that we decide to write a book together. So, and we hope that we will also have a book to illustrate more the harm of anti-trafficking movement, and to uncover more what problem of the machine behind the anti-trafficking movement is operating to maintain the power, and also how to oppress the people. And thank you for sharing. Thank you.
Oh, well, that's the best outcome of all, which is that, as we say in the introduction, I think, or meant to say, it's really just the beginning. It's the seeds that are planted here that'll continue to grow, and hopefully the movement grows around all the new branches.